So look at Anthony Ryder from South Lyon, Michigan, recently selected as the Lions 2020 Fan of the Year. He has a passion about sports broadcasting.
With the 112th selection in the 2021 NFL Draft, the Detroit Lions select Amon-Ra St. Brown, wide receiver, USC. One pride, baby! Yeah!
The NFL draft season is fastly approaching, and as the Detroit Lions near the end of their 2024 free agency campaign, we're going to shift our looks over to the NFL draft. In just over a month's time, the Detroit Lions will be hosting the 2024 NFL draft, and with the 29th overall pick, they're going to have an opportunity to add a stud to this team, whether that be on the offense or the defensive side of the ball. Brad Holmes has ensured that they will likely be taking the best player available at the pick. And today, I wanted to take a look at an early big board for the Detroit Lions, separated into three tiers, that being players that likely will not be at 29, but could be potential trade-up targets, players that will likely be at 29 and be great value for the Detroit Lions, or potentially players in the early second round if the Lions decide to trade out of their first-round pick and move down to acquire some more assets. In all three tiers, I think these players will fit the Detroit Lions perfectly, and I think the Lions would be very interested in each and every prospect. Now, before we do get into it, I want to preface that these tiers are not separated. They're not ordered. So the first player that I talk about in a tier is not necessarily the best player in that tier. And I will specify some of the players I like more and some of the players that I like a little bit less. But I think all of them would be great fits for the Detroit Lions, and all of them very much belong in each and every tier that they are in. So with that being said, let's not waste any more time, and let's kick it off with the first tier of players the Lions may have interest in. Now, again, this is the unlikely tier, players that will probably be gone long before 29, but if Brad Holmes decides to get aggressive, if Brad Holmes decides to trade up into the first round, which we've seen before, these are players I think he could potentially be looking to trade up for. The first player, and arguably I think the best player on the Detroit Lions board, is going to be Terrion Arnold, a 6'1" cornerback from the University of Alabama, who last year came away with 5 interceptions for the Crimson Tide. He's big, he's fast, he's explosive, he has good ball skills, he tackles really well, and in my opinion, is the best cornerback in this class. I think pairing him with Carlton Davis would make this secondary almost elite, and I think Terrion Arnold is potentially the next Pat Surtain. He's potentially the next Sauce Gardner. He is the next young elite cornerback in the NFL, and if there was going to be a guy in this draft class that I bet on to be an all-pro, that I would bet on to be an immediate impact starter and a Pro Bowl caliber player, it would be Terrion Arnold. Now, another cornerback that I want to talk about is going to be Kenyon Mitchell, the cornerback from Toledo. He is my cornerback too in this class. I think he is almost as good as Terrion Arnold, but I think he's just a little bit less explosive, a little bit less in the speed department. Not that he's slow, not that he's not quick, but I think Terrion Arnold just has another gear to him. But I mean, Kenyon Mitchell is phenomenal. He is big, he is fast, he is long. I would argue he has even better ball skills than Terrion Arnold. He is, I mean, just a phenomenal cornerback prospect. He did go to a smaller school, so he didn't play as much competition. He doesn't have near as much ball production as Terrion Arnold. But if the Lions walk away with either of these two cornerbacks, I think that it's an easy A+ almost for the draft class, because you're getting a top 2 cornerback in a position of need. And I think it's going to secure the secondary for a very long time. Now, defensive linemen that we want to talk about, Laiatu Latu is my edge rusher 1 and Jared Verse is my edge rusher 2. I think both of these guys would be phenomenal for the Detroit Lions. Laiatu Latu reminds me a lot of Aiden Hutchinson coming out of Michigan. He is a player that I absolutely love. Doesn't have the most explosive first step, isn't necessarily the quickest or the fastest, but I would argue is the best technician in this draft class, has the best use of his hands, has showed every single pass rushing move in the books. And I think pairing him with Aiden Hutchinson would be so incredibly productive. He reminds me a lot of Jalen Phillips as well when he was coming out, a player that funnily enough, started at the same school as Jalen Phillips, had to medically retire for a year, the same as Jalen Phillips, came back and transferred to UCLA like Jalen Phillips. And he's a player that, now is on the Miami Dolphins and being a pretty productive player. And I think if we were to get that caliber of player out of Laiatu Latu, I think it would be well worth the 29th overall pick, or potentially even trading up into the mid to early 20s for it. Jared Verse reminds me a lot of a different player. Jared Verse is I think, more explosive pass rusher. I think he's a stronger pass rusher. I think he has really good speed to power and just phenomenal power overall. He is a player that I think is great in the run defense. He really doesn't have too many weaknesses, although I do think his effort at times is a little bit lacking. But if you can get him to fully buy in, I think you have a really, really good player on your hands. And I think you're getting a guy that is potentially going to be a Kayvon Thibodeau with the added benefit of being good in the run defense. Now, every once in a while, he goes rogue and tries to, dip inside for a flashy tackle for loss, and it leaves the defense a little exposed. But I do think he has the ability to stop the run, and I have seen several times over that he has been able to do so. So I'm not too concerned about that. The only thing I would really put against him is potentially, like I said, a little bit of that energy and that lack of a motor. Now, Johnny Newton is a player, the defensive tackle from Illinois, that I think would be perfect for the Detroit Lions. There are some mock drafts where he does fall to 29 just because defensive tackle isn't necessarily the biggest position of need and isn't necessarily the most valued position in the NFL. But I do think he will be gone roughly between 15 to 22. I think somewhere in that range, if not a little bit higher. We saw, of course, Jalen Carter last year go at 9 with the character concerns, and I don't think Johnny Newton has any of that. I wouldn't be surprised if he goes anywhere from 10 to 20 if he goes in that range, but I think he is the best defensive tackle in that class. I think he's a great pass rusher. I think he's a great run stopper. I just overall think he's the best defensive tackle available in the draft. And I know that the Lions just went out and they signed DJ Reader, and they're likely going to re-sign Aleem McNeil. But with DJ Reader being on the older side and kind of being on the back end of his career, I wouldn't be surprised if the Lions go out and they address defensive tackle in this draft. They let go of a couple of them this year, including, I believe Tuilatu, the player that they signed very late in the NFL season that played in the NFC Championship, as well as Benito Jones, and they haven't replaced all of those guys yet. So I think there's a good possibility the Lions draft one, and if Johnny Newton's there at 29, you run to the podium. And if he's fallen into the mid-20s, you might trade up 3 or 4 spots to secure your defensive tackle of the future. Sticking with defensive tackles, Byron Murphy II, I think, is the second best defensive tackle in this class. A bigger guy, great run support, great power. I don't think he's quite as quick as Johnny Newton. I don't think he has the pass rushing ability of Johnny Newton. But if you're talking about a pure run stuff, or you're talking about a big body in the middle, I don't think anybody in this class is bigger than Byron Murphy, and I think nobody is quite as powerful in the middle as Byron Murphy either. Looking at the offensive side of the ball, I think there's 2 players that the Lions could potentially trade up for, that being Jackson Powers Johnson, the center from Oregon, as well as Brian Thomas, the 6'3" ex-wide receiver from LSU. Both of these guys, I think, will be gone in the early 20s, if not late teens, but I think that they both make sense for the Detroit Lions. The best center in the class, obviously, to either play guard or center for the Detroit Lions for a very long time. He doesn't have to play immediately, but is going to be the strong backup to really all 3 of the interior positions. And then, of course, if Frank Ragnow retires early, you switch him to center. If Graham Glasgow goes out, you put him there. If Kevin Zeitler retires or obviously leaves after this year, you put him there and plug him in. It's a basically 3 picks in one. And I think he's the best offensive or interior offensive lineman in this class. And then Brian Johnson, I have as technically wide receiver 5, but I do think he's going to go a little bit earlier than my wide receiver 4 just because of the size, the explosiveness, the ball production. And I do think he's going to be a very high pick. And I know the Lions have interviewed him. I know the Lions are interested in him. So I think there's a good chance that he potentially goes as well. Getting into tier 2, these are players that I think are likely to be at 29. As we get into it, obviously, we just talked about 7, 8 prospects in the first tier. We're not even talking about most of the offensive talent. So as we get into the mid to late 20s, these guys are potentially going to be there, if not even likely to be at the 29th overall pick. And when the Lions are on the board, these are players I think the Lions are really going to like. Chop Robinson is my edge rusher 3 in this class. I think he has the quickest first step in this class. I think he's got really good bend. I think he's got great speed around the edge. He wasn't super productive in college, but there was a lot of plays watching him where I was like, wow, he got to the quarterback really quickly. The quarterback just got the football out and it turned into an incompletion. It turned into an interception. It turned into a turnover. And even though those stats don't show up for Chop Robinson, he very much impacts the game more than his stat sheet would suggest. And I think he's a really good player and arguably the best pure pass rusher, although I'm not quite as convinced about his run stopping ability as I am with the other two. Kool-Aid McKinstry is my favorite player in this tier. I think he should and could easily be cornerback one in this class. At his pro day, just ran a 4.4, I believe 7 with a fractured foot. I mean, he is not as big as Teron Arnold, not as explosive as Teron Arnold, not as productive as Teron Arnold, but he's a 6'1" cornerback with good speed, with great technique, with, I mean, just really everything you would want out of a starting cornerback. And I know he's falling because of the rise of Teron Arnold, because of the rise of Kenyon Mitchell, because of the rise potentially of Nate Wiggins running a 4.29 at the combine, because of some of these other cornerbacks making some noise in the offseason. Kool-Aid McKinstry is going to fall because he didn't test at the combine, because he wasn't fully healthy at his pro day, because he's hurt. He has a broken foot at this point. So that could all cause him to fall. Plus, I just don't think he's the biggest, most outspoken player, which obviously hurts your draft stock a little bit throughout this process. But I think he's just as good a cornerback as anybody in this class. And I think if he's at 29, the Lions would love to add him to the secondary. Same thing goes with Nate Wiggins, a player that I think potentially might not be a 29, but very well could be. A bigger, kind of faster, more athletic player from Clemson, a guy that I don't think is quite as good as Kool-Aid or the other two, but a guy that I still think could slide in at cornerback one easily on a lot of teams, and I think would be a great cornerback if he can stay healthy. Darius Robinson's a great player from Memphis, an edge rusher, my edge rusher 4 or 5. I believe my edge rusher 5 on the list behind Shop versus Latu and as well as Turner from Alabama. Darius Robinson, I don't think has the quickest step in this class, but I think is really, really good, very underrated. Only played college football for a couple of years and only played high school football from a junior and senior standpoint. He didn't start playing until about 6 years ago, meaning he still has a lot of growth and a lot of developing to go. He was productive in the SEC. He was great in the SEC, and I think he'd be a great addition to the Detroit Lions. Grew up a Detroit Lions fan. I think with the new defensive line coach, they'd love to have an athlete. They'd love to have a project like Darius Williams, and I wouldn't be surprised if they go out and they draft the player from Memphis. T'Vondre Sweat is the second defensive tackle from Texas we're going to talk about. Again, I think he's really, really good. I think he's very worthy of a first-round pick, but I think he's just a little bit less of everything than his teammate in Byron Murphy II. If he's at 29, I could see them taking T'Vondre Sweat, but I think this is one of the lesser options in tier 2. As you would probably expect, you're going to favor Darius Robinson, Chop Robinson, and the cornerbacks over potentially a defensive tackle that very well could be going into the second round. A.D. Mitchell's a player that I think is really good. My wide receiver 4 in this class, who I actually have graded higher than a guy like Brian Thomas Jr., but I think because he's lacking a little bit in size compared to Thomas, I think because he's lacking a little bit of speed compared to Thomas, he's going to fall a little bit farther in the draft. But I think A.D. Mitchell reminds me a lot of CeeDee Lamb from a route running perspective, from a hands perspective, from a competitiveness perspective. There's a lot of things to like about A.D. Mitchell. I think he separates really well, potentially better than a couple of the other guys ahead of him. He's a great player. I think he's going to be a great wide receiver. And I think adding him to this offense and having, A.D. Mitchell, Amon-Ra St. Brown, and Jameson Williams as your 3 wide receivers would be a great trio for Jared Goff. And then I think Kingsley Suamatua, I believe is how you say it, Penei Sewell's actual cousin, who goes to BYU and is going to likely be a first-round pick. He's not quite as good as Penei Sewell was coming out, but he's 6'6", brutal in the run game, really solid in the passing game. And I know the Lions have 2 really good bookend tackles, but with Taylor Decker's contract coming to an end, with obviously you having to pay Penei Sewell very soon, I wouldn't be surprised if they maybe move on from Taylor Decker if they can't work out a good team-friendly deal, and they move on, potentially shifting Penei Sewell over to left tackle, or just leaving him at right tackle and sliding Kingsley right into left tackle, then paying Penei Sewell and having a good young left tackle on a rookie contract as you continue to pay guys like Graham and Ragnow and Sewell. Then you have 2 younger guys on the offensive line to potentially eat up some of that salary cap and cushion the blow of those big numbers. I think all 6, 7 of these players are likely to be at 29. Will they all be at 29? Probably not, but at least 3, 4, maybe 5 of these players will be. I think the Lions are going to have a pretty good pick of the litter at their 29th overall pick if they do stay put. Moving on to the trade down category. These are guys that I think are definitely more second round picks, guys that are probably going to go from that 33 to 50 range. But if you have a team like Washington who wants to trade up back into the first round, if you want a team like Carolina who could potentially trade up and want that first round pick late in the first round, they have multiple second round picks and third round picks to give up, and they have extra assets to move on from. So I do think there is a good opportunity for them to potentially do that. And then the Lions could get 2 of these players potentially, as opposed to 1 at 29. First player, of course, TJ Tampa is a cornerback from Iowa State, a player that is really, really good. I think I have him at cornerback 5 or 6 at this point, kind of neck and neck with Kamari Lassiter from Georgia. He's a player that I think is bigger, I think is pretty physical, has some good athletic traits, but isn't quite on the same level as the top 4 cornerbacks. We have a pair of guards here being Christian Haynes and Graham Barton, just 2 players I think would slide really well into the offensive line of the Detroit Lions. Wouldn't have to play immediately. You give them to Hank Fairley, you let him develop for a year. When Kevin Zeitler moves on, you slide one of them into the right guard, or if they play left guard, you slide them into left guard and you put Graham back on the right side of the offensive line. Either way, I think they'd both be great future assets for the Lions, although they wouldn't be immediate impact players. Same thing goes with Zach Frazier. If you miss out on Jackson Powers Johnson, Zach Frazier I think is easily the second best center in this class. A player that, would easily fill in for Frank Ragnow if he is to retire after the 2024 season. Again, not an immediate asset, but a player that is going to future-proof your roster. And for a team like the Lions that don't have many needs right now, future-proofing your roster could go a long way for your sustained and future success. Adisa Isaac is a player that I love in this draft class. He's a player that I would put right up there with Chop Robinson, and a player that I think is really, really good. He's a little smaller than Chop. He's a little smaller than Verse and Latu, and I don't think he's quite as good in the run defense, but this guy is athletic. He is a freak. He is obviously a great athlete going to Penn State and being an edge rusher / linebacker. It's just kind of the bill. I think he's a player that could be a second-round pick for the Detroit Lions. I don't think he makes it to 61 or 62, wherever the Lions are picking in the second round, but I do think he is an early second-round pick, and if the Lions really do trade down into the early second, I think he could be a great edge rushing partner for Aiden Hutchinson and be a phenomenal player for the Detroit Lions. Cooper Bieber is a player, again, a guard from Kansas State. Just, again, a future-proof player, a great guard. I think would slide in really well for a lot of teams on day one. Wouldn't have to on the Detroit Lions, but if you go into the second round and you're like, hey, we're not going to get, our wide receiver 1. We're not going to get our cornerback 1. Let's get, potentially the best guard in the draft, potentially a top 2 or 3 player at that position, as opposed to wide receiver 6, cornerback 7, right? Whatever that may be. I think that, again, Bieber is just a really good option there. Kamari Lassiter, the cornerback from Georgia, is a player that underwhelmed me from an athletic standpoint, but definitely impressed me from a talent standpoint, from a tape standpoint. He's very aggressive. He's a good tackler. I think would fit the culture of the Detroit Lions really, really well. But again, I think that underwhelming athleticism, I think that underwhelming 40 time, I just don't think he's the greatest athlete, which I think is going to put him behind some of the better athletes in this class. But again, if you're in the second round, I think Kamari Lassiter could start for the Detroit Lions right now and be a really, really good asset. And then I think Chris Braswell from Alabama is the last player on this list. I really like Chris Braswell. I think he's a really good, underrated player. A lot of people don't talk about him because he's a fifth-year senior, because he's an older prospect, but he was just as productive, if not more productive in some games than his teammate in Dallas Turner. He's just as athletic. He's just as productive. He is a great player, and I think the Lions would love to have him opposite of Aiden Hutchinson. Now, a player I didn't put on this list who seems to be falling closer to the end of the second round, if not early third round, is Xavier Leggett, although I do think a lot of people really like him for the Lions wide receiver. He's another option that I didn't put on this list, again, because it seems like he is kind of falling to the wayside in this draft process. He's a player that I could see going as a second-round pick, but also I think could potentially fall in the draft a little bit, just as it seems as of right now, based on the mocks and based off of a lot of experts' projections. But he's a player you could throw on as well, being that ex-wide receiver archetype, as the Lions continue to look for that. So with all of that being said, going over 20-plus prospects today at the top and middle of the Lions draft order. That is kind of my big board for right now. I think the Lions, obviously, as you can probably tell, are going to focus heavy on cornerback, offensive line, wide receiver, as well as defensive line. I think the defense is going to be a big addition for the Lions this year. The Lions have gone back-to-back seasons with top 6 offenses, and they've gone back-to-back seasons with bottom 10 defenses. Even with the additions of Carlton Davis, even with the additions of DJ Reader, even with the addition of Marcus Davenport, I don't think pass rushers off the board. I don't think defensive tackles off the board. And I do not think at all that cornerback is not going to be a position of value for the Lions. Brad Holmes was just at the pro day of Alabama yesterday, so we know he's looking at some Alabama prospects, which is why I had 4 on this list. But with all that being said, that is, like I figured I said, those are my favorite prospects for the Detroit Lions in the early round. I'd be very curious what you guys have to say about each and every one and what your favorite prospects are. We'll probably talk about some of these guys individually and more in depth in future videos. But for all of that being said, that's all I got for you guys right now. Thank you all so very much for watching. And until next time, and as always, go Lions.